Jameel Jaffer is our next speaker, and Jameel is the executive director of the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. He's a really big deal. Prior to joining the Knight Institute, he was deputy legal director at the ACLU and director of the American Civil Liberties Union's Center for Democracy, where he oversaw the ACLU's work relating to free speech, privacy, technology, national security, and international human rights. He has argued civil liberties cases in multiple appeals courts as well as the U.S. Supreme Court, and has testified many times before federal agents and agencies in the U.S. Congress. So please join me in welcoming, belatedly, Jameel Jaffer. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you all for being here, and thanks also to the Pittsburgh Foundation and to the Heinz Endowments for sponsoring this conference. I also want to say thanks to Grant Oliphant for those really thoughtful and powerful remarks about Antoine Rose and about the separation of families at the border, and about the creeping threat of authoritarianism. I'm not going to talk about any of those things. I'm going to talk about digital journalism and the new public square. So a few months ago, The Guardian published a pretty remarkable story revealing that a Cambridge University researcher had harvested as many as 50 million Facebook profiles for Cambridge Analytica, which is a data analytics firm that was headed at the time by Steve Bannon, one of Donald Trump's key advisors. The researcher, Alexander Kogan, collected the profiles with an app called This Is Your Digital Life. And through that app, he paid Facebook users small amounts of money to take personality tests and to consent to the collection of their data for academic purposes. And then he turned the profiles over to Cambridge Analytica, which used them, The Guardian said, to predict and influence American voters' choices at the ballot box. The Guardian story relied in significant part on the account of Christopher Wiley, who is a Canadian researcher who had helped establish Cambridge Analytica and who had worked with Kogan on the Facebook project. Wiley told The Guardian, "We exploited Facebook to harvest millions of people's profiles, and we built models to target their inner demons. That was what Cambridge Analytica was built on." So most of you probably remember the Guardian story. You may not be familiar, though, with what happened the day before the Guardian published it. As the Guardian's editors were readying that story for publication, they received a letter from Facebook's lawyers. The letter threatened a lawsuit if the Guardian went ahead with the story. Facebook knew the Guardian story would provoke disbelief and outrage and perhaps even a regulatory backlash, and so they tried to quash it with the threat of litigation. Now, there's nothing unusual, unfortunately, about powerful actors threatening litigation to preempt unflattering news coverage. Intimidating missives of the kind that Facebook's lawyers sent to The Guardian are a staple of the media sphere, both in the United Kingdom and here in the United States. But Facebook isn't just any powerful actor. It's one of the largest corporations in the world. It has more than 2 billion users, almost 200 million here in the United States. And through its human and algorithmic decision-making, it has immense influence on how its users engage with one another and with the communities around them. It's no accident that stories about political polarization, filter bubbles, election integrity, the spread of disinformation online, mob violence in Sri Lanka, and even ethnic cleansing in Myanmar have Facebook as their common denominator. Facebook has a powerful, if often invisible, influence on what we once would have called the public square. And through that influence, Facebook affects societies all over the world. It's worth pausing to reflect on that influence. In an important new article, the legal scholar Kate Klonick argues that the social media platforms should be thought of as systems of governance because they're now the principal regulators of speech that takes place online. Through their control of the new public square, the platforms are exercising power we ordinarily associate with state actors, that is, with governments. One facet of that power, the facet that Klonick explores, is sometimes called content moderation, by which we usually mean the determination of which speech can go up on the platforms and which can't. Facebook, for example, routinely removes user content that shows graphic violence or nudity, as well as hate speech, as Facebook defines it, and speech glorifying terrorism. The other major platforms have similar policies. There's an ongoing debate about the ways in which the companies are exercising that power, whether they're taking down too much speech or too little, or maybe even both. In an essay published last week by the Hoover Institution, Daphne Keller observes that people from across the political spectrum are convinced that the platforms are silencing speech for the wrong reasons. This debate is important because increasingly it's the platforms rather than governments that delineate the outer limits of public discourse, and also because the platform's power to censor isn't subject to constitutional or regulatory limits. But content moderation, at least in the narrow sense of that phrase, hardly begins to describe the platform's influence. The social media companies' more fundamental power over public discourse is reflected not principally in their decisions about which speech to exclude from their platforms, but in their decisions about how to organize and structure the speech that remains. They dictate which kinds of interactions are possible and which aren't, which kinds of speech will be made more prominent and which will be suppressed, which communities will be facilitated and which communities will be foreclosed. If the new public square were an ocean, Facebook would control not only which fish got to swim in it, but also the temperature and salinity of the water, the force and direction of the currents, and the ebb and flow of the tides. As my colleague Alex Abdo likes to say, social media is the social medium. But despite the singular role that the platforms now play, our collective understanding of them is limited, and we sometimes struggle even to describe what they are. When is a platform a publisher? When is it a common carrier? For the past year, the Knight Institute has been litigating a First Amendment challenge to President Trump's practice of blocking critics from his Twitter account. The case turns on the question of whether the president's account, @RealDonaldTrump, is a public forum. The litigation has been a competition of analogies. Is the president's Twitter account like a town hall or a park? Or is it more like a radio station? Heather Whitney, a philosopher and a legal theorist, has written a fascinating paper about whether the social media companies are properly thought of as editors. Her paper is further evidence that we're still trying to figure out what the platforms are and which labels to attach to them. Last year, the Supreme Court decided an important case involving the First Amendment right of access to social media. The decision was unanimous, but Justice Kennedy, who wrote the court's opinion, and Justice Alito, who concurred in it, disagreed about whether the platforms in their entirety should be characterized as public forums. At some level, both justices seemed to understand that the conceptual vocabulary available to them was inadequate. Justice Kennedy wrote, "While we now may be coming to the realization that the cyber age is a revolution of historic proportions, we can't appreciate yet its full dimensions and vast potential to alter how we think, express ourselves, and define who we want to be." Justice Kennedy continued, "The forces and directions of the internet are so new, so protean, and so far-reaching that courts must be conscious that what they say today might be obsolete tomorrow." If our collective understanding of the platforms is limited, it's in part because the social media companies have guarded so jealously the information that would help us understand them. Over the last years, they've begun to share information about instances in which governments compel them to remove user-generated content or compel them to turn over user data. They've begun to share information about the limits they themselves impose on the kinds of content that users can post on their platforms. Just a few weeks ago, Facebook released the internal guidelines it uses to enforce its community standards, a release that marked what the Electronic Frontier Foundation described as a sea change in Facebook's reporting practices. These disclosures are commendable, but they're also overdue and inadequate, as EFF also observed. Perhaps under new pressure from the public and from regulators around the world, the companies can be compelled to disclose more. Let's also recognize, though, that one reason the companies aren't more transparent is that they themselves don't fully understand the decisions they're making. To some extent, that's by choice. The Guardian journalist who broke the Cambridge Analytica story spoke to an engineer who had once been in charge of policing third-party app developers at Facebook. The engineer said he tried to warn Facebook about the growing black market for user data. Facebook wasn't interested in hearing about it, he said. He told The Guardian, Facebook was in a stronger legal position if it didn't know about the abuse that was happening. They felt it was better not to know. It would be a mistake to think that public ignorance in this context is simply a result of the company's refusal to release information. The information we most need, the companies don't have. The truth is that the companies are engaged in a massive social experiment with no precedent in human history. They rely increasingly on continuously evolving algorithms whose complexity defies understanding. They don't understand their own platforms, and still less do they understand the platform's broader social and political implications. They're in over their heads. When Facebook was asked about the reach of disinformation in the months preceding the 2016 presidential election, it first said that 10 million people had seen political ads posted by accounts linked to the Russian Internet Research Agency. Jonathan Albright, a researcher at Columbia's journalism school, then reported that 6 Russia-linked pages alone had reached 19 million people. Earlier this year, Facebook conceded that content posted by Russia-linked accounts had reached as many as 126 million people. Now, it's an important question exactly how much influence that content actually had. But if Zuckerberg's recent congressional testimony showed anything, it's that Facebook is a black box, even to Facebook. Zuckerberg himself has sometimes acknowledged this. In a recent interview, he conceded, "It's tough to be transparent when we don't first have a full understanding of the state of some of the systems. So, against that background, we should recognize that independent journalism and research about the platforms is extraordinarily valuable, and that obstacles to this kind of journalism and research are especially problematic. To the extent these obstacles impede us from understanding the forces that invisibly shape public discourse, they're best thought of as obstacles to self-government. We should view them in the same way we'd view laws preventing us from reading federal statutes, or attending congressional hearings, or accessing judicial opinions. They impede us from understanding the forces that govern us. Last-ditch legal efforts to block stories before they go to print, like the letter that Facebook's lawyers sent to The Guardian, aren't the only obstacles worth worrying about in this context. Perhaps the most significant impediments to journalism and research about the platforms arise from the company's terms of service, which bar journalists and researchers from using digital tools that are indispensable to the study of the platforms at scale. Most significantly, all of the major social media platforms bar users from collecting information from their platforms through automated means. Journalists and researchers can collect this information manually, but most of the platforms forbid them from collecting it using computer code. That prohibition is significant because it's impossible to study trends and patterns and information flows without collecting information at scale. And it's impossible to collect information at scale without collecting it digitally. So the effect of the prohibition is to make some of the most important journalism and research off limits. Some platforms, including Facebook, also prohibit the use of temporary research accounts, the kinds of accounts that could allow journalists and researchers to better study issues of discrimination and disinformation. That prohibition, too, prevents journalists and researchers from doing work we need them to do. These impediments are substantial in themselves. They're made more so by a federal statute called the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. The Justice Department understands that statute to impose civil and criminal penalties on those who violate the platform's terms of service. On the Justice Department's reading, the law makes it a crime for a journalist or researcher to study the platforms using basic digital tools. The very existence of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act discourages journalists and researchers from undertaking projects that are manifestly in the public interest. Projects focused on, for example, the spread of disinformation and junk news, political polarization, and unlawful discrimination in advertising. Anyone who undertakes these projects does so under the threat of legal action by the platforms and the Justice Department. When journalists and researchers do undertake these projects, they often modify their investigations to avoid violating terms of service, even if doing so makes their work less valuable to the public. In some cases, the fear of liability leads them to abandon projects altogether. Now, I want to acknowledge that the social media companies may have good reasons for generally prohibiting the use of these digital tools on their platforms. Facebook's prohibition against automated collection is presumably meant in part to impede the ability of commercial competitors, data aggregators, and others to collect, use, and misuse the data that Facebook's users post publicly. Facebook's prohibition against the use of fake accounts reflects, in part, an effort to ensure that users can feel confident that other users they interact with are real people. Intentionally or not, though, Facebook is also impeding journalists and researchers' ability to study, understand, and report about the platform. It's difficult to study a digital machine like Facebook without the use of digital tools. So, I want to return to a point I made earlier, that we should think of independent journalism and research about the platforms as especially valuable, and that we should think of obstacles to these things as especially problematic. Half a century ago, the Supreme Court decided New York Times versus Sullivan, the landmark case that established crucial First Amendment protections that publishers rely on even today. The case, as some of you will know, arose out of an advertisement soliciting contributions for the Committee to Defend Martin Luther King and the Struggle for Freedom in the South. L.B. Sullivan, the Public Safety Commissioner for Montgomery, Alabama, filed a libel suit against 4 of the clergymen who signed the ad, and also against the New York Times, which had published it. The case was tried in Alabama, and the jury awarded $500,000 in damages. But the U.S. Supreme Court reversed. In his opinion for a unanimous court, Justice Brennan explained that the First Amendment was intended first and foremost to ensure the freedom of public debate on what he called public questions. Quoting an earlier case, he wrote, "The maintenance of opportunity for free political discussion, to the end that government may be responsive to the will of the people, is a fundamental principle of our constitutional system. And in his opinion's most celebrated passage, he invoked this nation's, quote, profound national commitment to the principle that debate on public issues should be uninhibited, robust, and wide open. Justice Brennan was focused, in particular, on speech critical of government officials, because the case before him involved that kind of speech. But the key insight behind his opinion has broader implications. The insight is that the First Amendment was intended most of all to protect the speech necessary for self-government. Or as Harry Calvin Jr. put it in a now famous essay that was published only months after the New York Times case was decided, the central meaning of the First Amendment is to protect, quote, the speech without which democracy cannot function. Let me concede right away that there's a large distance between the question that was presented to the court in the New York Times case and the questions I started off with today. But it seems to me that in an era in which the social media companies control the public square, in an era in which these companies are in a very real sense our governors, journalism and research focused on these companies implicates the very core of the First Amendment. Journalism and research that help us better understand the forces that shape public discourse and that help us hold accountable the powerful actors that control these forces is essential to self-government. It's what the First Amendment is for. Before I close, I want to offer a few thoughts about what the companies, the courts, and Congress could do to better protect this speech, and more generally to ensure that the public has the information it needs in order to understand the new public square and to hold accountable the companies that control it. First, the companies should be more transparent about the ways in which they're shaping public discourse. David Kaye, the United Nations Special Rapporteur for Free Expression, wrote earlier this week that the companies should disclose, quote, radically more information about the nature of their rulemaking and enforcement concerning expression on their platforms. In a report filed with the UN Human Rights Council, incidentally, on the same day the US withdrew from the Human Rights Council, Kaye recommends that companies issue public opinions when they remove content from their platforms so that users and others can better understand why content is being taken down and so that they can challenge the company's decisions when they think those decisions are unjustified. I think Kaye is right. As he says, in public regulation of speech, we expect some form of accountability when authorities get it wrong. We should see that happening online too. But we need the platforms to be transparent not only about what speech they're taking down, but about how they're shaping the speech they're not taking down. What kinds of speech and associations are they privileging? And what forms does that privilege take? What kinds of speech and association are they marginalizing? And what forms does that marginalization take? Kaye's report has a different focus, but he highlights the need for transparency about a specific form of content curation. Quote, if companies are ranking content on social media feeds based on interactions between users, he writes, they should explain the data collected about such interactions and how this informs the ranking criteria. The more general point is that companies should be more transparent about how they're shaping public discourse. They should be more forthcoming about the forces at work in the new public square. Second, the social media companies should make clear that they won't enforce their terms of service against those who use digital tools on their platforms in the service of bona fide journalism and research. Again, many of the questions that are most urgent right now are ones that the companies themselves aren't able to answer. The company should be facilitating, not obstructing, the work of those who might be able to provide answers the companies can't. Even if the companies have legitimate commercial, privacy, or security reasons for generally prohibiting the use of certain digital investigative tools, it should be possible for them to create a kind of carve-out from their terms of service for public interest journalism and research, a carve-out that expands the space for these activities while protecting the privacy of users and the integrity of the platforms. Incidentally, the data privacy regulation that went into effect several weeks ago in Europe supplies a conceptual framework for exactly that kind of carve-out. As a general matter, the new regulation places significant restrictions on the use of digital tools to collect, analyze, and disseminate information obtained from social media platforms. But the regulation also encourages individual countries to exempt journalism and research from those general restrictions. A handful of countries, including the United Kingdom, have already recognized exemptions of that kind. European privacy legislation, in other words, distinguishes between those who use digital tools for private or nefarious purposes and journalists who use those tools to inform the public about matters of public concern. The company's terms of service should be similarly discerning. The companies can protect user privacy and platform integrity without categorically prohibiting digital journalism and research that is overwhelmingly in the public interest. Third, the court should consider refusing to enforce the company's terms of service against those who responsibly use digital tools in the service of bona fide journalistic and research projects. As a general matter, courts enforce contracts as written, and as a general matter, they should enforce the terms of service too. But there are contexts in which courts decline to enforce contractual provisions that conflict with public policy. Often these cases involve contractual terms whose enforcement would disable democratic institutions or processes. For example, where a contract would prohibit a person from running for office, or from criticizing public officials, or from disclosing information of overriding public importance. Those cases are surely relevant here. For reasons I've already explained, journalism and research focused on the social media companies is of special democratic importance because of the unique role that the companies play in shaping public discourse. Terms of service that impede that kind of journalism and research are in tension with our commitment to self-government, because again, they impede us from understanding the forces that profoundly shape our interactions, our communities, and our democracy. Finally, Congress should amend the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act so that digital journalists and researchers can do their work without the risk of incurring civil and criminal penalties. Journalists and researchers who are investigating questions that implicate the very core of the First Amendment's concern shouldn't have to operate under the threat of legal sanctions. Let me close just by bringing us back to the Guardian story I began with. That story about Cambridge Analytica is in part a reminder that the platforms are entirely justified to worry about the ways in which their users' data can be exploited by third parties. The story should also be a reminder, though, of how reliant we are on the work of independent journalists and researchers. If we want to understand the platforms, if we want to understand the new public square, independent journalism and research are crucial. Whatever the First Amendment means in the digital age, it should encompass robust protection for this kind of journalism and research. Again, this kind of journalism and research is what the First Amendment is for. Thank you very much.